Hey guys, this is Jim, WT1W, and you're watching FEP Labs Radio. Thanks for stopping by, I appreciate it. So in this video, I want to go over the basics of how to create a code plug. In DMR, we talk about code plugs all the time, and a code plug is a config file. It's the same thing. You can use the terms interchangeably. I don't know the origin of why we call this a code plug. Don't care. It's a config file. It's a code plug. Same. So I've gotten a lot of comments on this channel for some older videos I did, and I've gotten comments on ham nuggets with Temporarily Offline that we do on Monday night. We've gotten comments on Coffee and Ham Radios on those shows about people, and in the Toads Discord. And there's a link to the Toads Discord below. We'd love to have you. A lot of comments about people having problems with their code plugs and throwing up their hands and just getting completely overwhelmed by creating a code plug. And I want to try and break it down into about 5 simple pieces, a couple of which are somewhat optional. So let's get at it right now and go over code plug basics. Okay, so when we talk about a code plug, which is what we have up here on the screen, you should be able to see this giant code plug file up here. There's some basic steps that you have to look at, like blocks, building blocks. When you build a house, you don't start with the roof or the windows or the kitchen floor. You start with the foundation. And until you got the foundation, you can't do anything else, which is why we build foundations, right? So it's much the same with DMR code plugs. Now, this is my methodology. I think this is the easiest way to do it. To me, it simplifies the whole process and removes a lot of the inherent complexity with DMR programming software. This method will work on anybody's CPS. The only difference is the buttons may be labeled slightly differently, but the functions are all the same, all there. What we're not going to talk about in this video is standard radio functions. We're going to talk about just building our digital code plug for use with a DMR hotspot, for example, or a DMR repeater, okay? We'll mention analog a little bit, but just because it's in the radio and it's in the code plug, I'm going to show you. After we kind of walk through what this looks like, then we're going to build a code plug, a real simple one, using these steps, okay? So the first thing you've got to do when you build a code plug is put in your radio ID. And until your radio ID is in the code plug file, ain't gonna work. Now, the one thing that they call it, and this is the BTEC DMR6X2 radios code plug software. TO has this radio, Ape has this radio, I have this radio. We think it's a great radio. And there's a newer version out now as well. This version is several years old, still works fine. So the first thing you got to do is put in your DMR ID. That is step 1, because until you get step 1 done, none of the rest of this stuff is ever going to work. Now, most DMR radios allow you to put in multiple radio IDs. So for example, if you had a club call, like KTOAD's, KT0ADS, I could put in KTOAD's DMR ID as well, and then I could operate my DMR radio as WT1W Jim, or I could operate it as KTOAD's. We're just going to put in the one, and you can see here that's what I have. There's my DMR ID, and that's what I've called the name of it. All right. Actually, I should probably rename that to WT1W, but it's the only one I have in the radio, so it doesn't really matter what it's named. That's step 1. We're done. Step 1 is finished. The next thing you've got to put in is your talk groups. Now, depending on your CPS, this may be called talk groups, it may be called digital contacts. This particular CPS has digital contacts, which we're going to talk about at the end of the video. It's basically the same stuff. These are all private calls, individual hams and their DMR IDs. This is a completely optional thing for any of these radios. You don't have to have this in there. Again, we'll talk about that a little more later. So right now we want to put in our digital talk groups. These are the digital talk groups that I have in this radio. This is step 2, and this has got to be step 2, or you're going to spin your wheels trying to do stuff you can't do because you haven't got steps 1 and steps 2 finished. So we've put in our radio ID. Now we want to put in our talk groups. And this is the list of talk groups or private calls that I have in here. In DMR, when you talk about a talk group or a private call, they're pretty much interchangeable in that a talk group is a group call and a DMR ID or private call is a specific user on the system. So I have KM9G in here down at the bottom of this list, you can see, and that's his DMR ID and that's his call, and that's a private call. So if he's got his radio turned on and is around a DMR repeater, I can key up and I will talk straight to Steve. We're not going through a talk group. It's still a digital contact. All right. You treat it the same as a talk group, except that's just radio to radio through the internet. Group calls go to a talk group that multiple people connect to. One of the things that people might miss when they're setting up their CPS software for their DMR radio is when they build their digital contacts here, they might change this and have this set as private call. And that's not going to necessarily work, depending on a lot of things on the backside that you can't see. So talk groups need to be group calls, and radio to radio needs to be private calls, generally. There are some exceptions, but we're not going to fool with any of that today. Parrot is a special case that will let you key up, say something, and then it repeats it back to you so you can hear what you sound like going through your hotspot or the local repeater. And that's treated as a private call. All right. So now that we've got those done, now we need to go to our potential optional step. This doesn't have to be done on a lot of radios. It doesn't have to be done on this radio, I know. On some older DMR radios, it may. I've seen cases, and I can't name the radios off the top of my head which ones they were. I've seen some of these things where the radio didn't work until you put in receive groups. So what we're going to do is we're going to put those in right now. And on this software, I believe it is a receive group call list. Yep. And you're going to have something, it's probably going to be called receive groups or receive group call list, something like that. So this step, possibly optional. If your DMR radio was manufactured in the last 3 years, you probably don't have to do this. I've done this, so I understood how it worked. I could take all this out and my radio would still work fine. And what I've done is I've made a receive group for each specific digital talk group I have listed in step 2. And you can see I made a receive group called Alabama Link, and then I moved the contact Alabama Link into this received group, and it's the only one in there. Same thing for America Link. I have America Link over here in the group. The group is named America Link, and that's how I've got it set up, so on and so forth for every digital contact I have. It doesn't hurt to do this. You won't break anything by doing this. The other thing you can do with this is you can get all kinds of squirrely and have a receive group with multiple digital contacts in it. That is way beyond the scope of basic CPS setup, and we're not going to talk about that at all. But receive groups, step 3, not a bad idea, possibly optional, possibly not. Okay, our next step is going to be our channels. And the channels are what we use to tie one of those digital numbers, Toads 319283 or Alabama Link 31010 or TO's specific radio. Channels are what we use to tie a digital contact to a frequency. The way I have my radio set up is I have a hotspot here in the house, one in my truck, one in the shop. They're on 3 different frequencies. I also have some analog channels that I might want to monitor on this radio. So I have channels that represent each of those different kinds of things. So the first thing I have here in this block of channels is the frequency for my DMR hotspot, which is 433.25. These are all digital because I'm linking these to talk groups. These are the talk groups they're linked to, and the digital contact or talk group. This is the channel name. You can call this anything, but I've named them the same thing as the contact. And this is how you tell your radio that I want to talk to Southeast USA on 433.25, and it's a specific digital talk group. So if we look at the channel, this is the channel name, anything you want. This is the frequency for my hotspot here, and I've told it it's digital, and I've told it it's low power. I'm talking to a hotspot that's about 8 feet away, so I don't need high power. And when you set this as digital, you're going to be able to come over here and edit this piece. We'll lose all the analog stuff because we're using the digital contact. So this is where I tell it what digital talk group I want to use. These are the list of digital talk groups we entered back in step 2. This one's Southeast USA, so I'm going to select it. This is the radio ID. It's the only one we have. This is from step 1. For your hotspot, it's going to be color code 1. You can change this if you want to in Pi-Star or WPSD. Doesn't matter. By default, it's going to be color code 1. And time slot 2. Again, by default, in both of those hotspot programs, it's going to be time slot 2. Just roll with it. This is our receive group list that we made that is tied to that specific contact. We may or may not need this. It depends on your radio and your CPS software. And no, I do not know what a TYT model 1237 alpha needs. I have no idea, and I'm not going to Google it for you. We can't use encryption, and we're done. That's it. So that channel is good to go. And if we go to our next channel, that's USA wide talk group. That's also on 433.25 because it's on my hotspot here. And the same thing, digital, low power, always permit transmit. You notice it sets the bandwidth automatically. Here's our digital parameters. And again, other than changing the contact and the receive group, this is all the same stuff. So these are channels to be used with my hotspot in the house. These are analog channels that I would use out and about. VHF, UHF call, local fire department, the local repeater, a couple, 3 repeaters here in town. These are all analog channels. We're going to group these in our next step. I just want to kind of run through this real quick. These are digital channels, and these are for me using with our local DMR repeater here in Montgomery County, Alabama. So again, they're all in the same frequencies. For not the analogs, they're all special and different, but the digital ones are going to be on the same frequency. So this lets me link to Alabama Link via the repeater. That's why I put /R on the name. Toads Digital and Parrot. I'm using the same contact as I used up here. The difference is we're going to this frequency set. Down here, this is going to be for my open spot. It's the same kind of deal. This is a different hotspot on a different frequency. Again, same thing, digital. I put in the names of it with /OS for open spot. This is in my truck. And down here is the DMR in my shop. And I have Toad /shop and Parrot /shop. And that's all I have out there. And then that's a couple extra analog channels that just got thrown in there. I haven't moved them. So that is what my channels look like. And that is our next step. So now we have our DMR ID in the radio. We have our digital contacts. We've created receive groups, 1 per each digital contact. And now we've got our channels set up. If you're only using your DMR radio in your house, you don't need to do all of this. All right. But I'm potentially using my DMR radio at one of 3 hotspots or the local repeater. So I've got all these different blocks of channels. Now, the next step, it's also optional. This is completely optional, but I highly recommend you do this because otherwise it'll make you crazy. And then you'll wake up one night and go, man, I should have listened to Jim when he said this. You want to do what's called zones, and that is our next step. If you come up here to zone, you can see I have, 5 zones here. So what a zone is a logical collection of all those channels that we've made, and they're lumped together in one spot. So what that does for you in every DMR radio I've ever seen, when I switch to a zone, the only talk groups or frequencies that I see in that zone are the ones that I have put in that zone. So if I'm on the analog zone, I'm only going to see analog radio channels, VHF, UHF call, the fire department, the YouTubers channel we use at Hamvention and Hamcation and all that. That's the only frequencies I'm going to see. I'm not going to see any DMR frequencies because they wouldn't work. Likewise, if I'm in the house playing with my 6X2, I'm going to be on the house DMR zone. And when I go to a zone and open it up, you'll see these zone channel members. These are the ones that are all on 433.25, that first block of channels I showed you. So these are digital contacts tied to a specific frequency, all grouped together in one zone. So I set my radio to house DMR, and I can rotate the channel knob and go through all of these talk groups and not see anything else. I won't see the fire department. I won't see the local repeaters. I won't see the, whatever. I'll only see these. So the 6X2, like most radios, has dual VFO. So I can have an analog zone on VFO A, and then I can put my house hotspot on VFO B, so I can monitor, flip back and forth, whatever. If we look at the next, this is my open spot zone. These are all the channels I made that are /OS, which means these channels are all tied to 433.9, my open spot frequency. That's the DMR hotspot in the shop, and that is empty. The analog zone, of course, is all the analog channels. So that is zones. If you go through those steps like that, your radio is pretty much set up. Now there's some tweaking and other things you can play with as far as the analog side. There's some stuff you can do on the digital side. You mostly don't need to fool with. Very few things need to be tinkered with on this. You can, and it may make it better for you. You can change a timeout timer, how long if it will let you talk when you keep the key held down, that kind of thing. And on this particular software, you're going to go to optional settings, and that will bring up this menu where we can tinker with all sorts of other radio functions. And I don't want to go through all of this stuff. So anyway, there's all sorts of radio settings you can tinker with. 9 times out of 10, you don't need to fool with any of that stuff. If you follow these steps, you will have a working DMR radio. The last piece to the setup before we move on is digital contact list, and that's what it's called in this CPS here. You can download all or part of the DMR database to your radio. There are probably some sites that let you have some functionality for free through radio vendor sites. You can pay radioid.net, I don't know, it's pretty cheap, and have access to create a custom database. Every DMR radio will hold a certain amount of contacts. The worldwide DMR database, the last time I looked, which has been probably 6 months or a year, was around 210,000, I think. A little more, a little less, give or take 20,000. This particular radio only holds 150,000 contacts, I think. So I cannot load the entire worldwide DMR ID database. You don't have to do this. What this gives you is if Alan Harvey, VA3UZ, and I have no idea, I've never talked to Alan, never met him, that's his DMR ID. So if Alan Harvey keys up and he's in a talk group I'm in, or he calls me directly, my radio is going to say VA3UZ Alan Harvey, Sparta, Ontario. It will show me his contact demographic information. You don't have to have any of that. If you don't do this, if you don't want to fool with it, or you don't care about it, or you're too cheap to pay for it, whatever, doesn't matter. What it means is if I call you or you're in a talk group, you're not going to see any information about the talker at all, because you don't have a database set up unless you've put me specifically in your contact list. And you can do that if you have a bunch of buddies. You can manually just key in this information for them, and that's all you need to fool with. You don't have to do this piece at all. This is a convenience feature so that you can see who's talking. Again, my radio won't hold the entire worldwide database. So the last time I updated this contact list, I think I got just the USA, Canada, Australia, UK, most of Europe kind of thing. I don't remember. I didn't get the whole world because I can't fit the whole world in the radio. So that is the digital contact list, and all the radios have this. The amount of contacts they can hold varies a lot from radio to radio. That is not to be confused with your talk groups. And I know I have said digital contacts and talk groups and used them interchangeably. As far as the radio cares, they're mostly the same thing. It's a number, and you have to have a way to get to it over a given DMR network. That's about it. The difference is Alan Harvey is a private call, and Toads is a group call, or America RC is a group call, or Alabama Link is a group call. Steve McGrain, KM9G, is a private call. Still a digital number. Works the same way. So that is all the things that you have to set up, and that will 99% of the time give you a working, functional code plug that will get your radio on the air, assuming you know the frequency that your hotspot's on, right? All right, now what I want to do, one last thing, is I want to create a new code plug from scratch. So now that we've told it we want to create a new one, we need to go back and go through our steps again. So we want to go to the radio ID list in this particular CPS. It may be called My Radio or Radio ID or whatever, but this is where I'm going to tell the CPS what my user ID, my DMR ID is. So mine is 312-315-2157 and 6x2. 2. All right, that is step one. Step two, we need to add some talk groups. So let's add a talk group. We're going to call this one Toads. That's a group call, 319-2083. Next, let's add in one more. Alabama Link, group call 31010. Okay, I now have 2 talk groups in my radio. Let's go add our receive groups. List 1, and this is a default name it creates because we started over. We'll call this one Toads. And it is already picked Toads because it's the first one, I guess. So that's great. We're going to create one more group. This one's going to be Alabama Link. We're going to select Alabama Link and move it over to our Alabama Link receive group. Boom. The group name and the contact that's associated with it. Might be an optional step, might not be. I don't know about your radio. So we've got that done. We need to do channels. So we're going to delete all these, and we're going to set this up for my local hotspot here in the house. Toads. 433.25, 433.25. It is digital. I want to go with low power. Over here on the digital part, it's already set to Toads. It's the only radio ID I have. Color code 1, time slot needs to go to 2. My receive group list is Toads, and I'm done. Let's do the next one. This is going to be Alabama Link. 433.25, 433.25. Digital, low power. Contact is going to be Alabama Link now instead of Toads. Color code 1, time slot 2. Still the only radio we have, 6x2. Receive group list is Alabama Link. And we've created 2 channels. If I want to get froggy and add an analog channel, VHF call, 146.52, 146.52. This is analog. And when I clicked analog, see how it grayed all the digital stuff out? We're going to leave it on high power. We're going to set it at 25 kilohertz. We're going to leave that stuff off. I don't care about any of that. There's no tone decode on that. And we have now created an analog channel. All right, now we're going to make zones. So obviously we need to have 2 zones. So let's create our first zone. House, DMR, whatever, house hotspot. And I want to move Toads into it. And I want to move Alabama Link into it. And there is a digital zone I just created. Let's create one more zone. We'll call that one analog. We're going to move VHF call into that. So now I have 2 zones. So we have our radio ID, check. We have our talk groups, check. We have our receive groups, check. We have our channels, check. We have our zones, check. And again, the last thing, if I wanted to, I could load some number of digital contacts from the worldwide database. So names would pop up whenever I key the radio. That is basic CPS software setup right there. If you follow those 5 things in that order, your radio's going to work. It's just almost not going to not work, because that's the stuff that's required. And if you do it this way, and I don't have my 6X2 at hand, on the 6X2, I can change zones by pushing an arrow key. So I'm on VFOA, I push the arrow to analog zone, and when I rotate the knob and I'm on selected VFOA, I see all my analog channels. I change to VFOB, and I might set it to the house hotspot zone, and then I rotate the knob and I can see Toads, Alabama Link, America RC, America Link, yada, 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 all those digital contacts. And I might rotate it all the way to KM9G and key up and talk to Steve. So that's what zones gives you, is a way to logically separate that stuff. If you don't use zones, and again, you don't have to, what you're going to end up with is a million channels that you're going to have to rotate the knob through. And you have to make a delineation between the frequencies for Toads from my hotspot in the house, or my hotspot in the truck, or my hotspot in my shop, or the hotspot or the local repeater DMR. So that's why the zones are so important, because I have the house stuff in a zone. I have the analog stuff in a zone. I have the shop stuff in a zone. I have the truck in a zone. So when I switch to a given zone, the only channels I'm seeing are ones that make sense for talking to my house hotspot or my truck hotspot or analog stuff around me. So that's how that works. Guys, that was a lot of information. I hope you were able to make sense out of some of that, and I hope it helps you out. Guys, thank you very much for watching. Appreciate it. 73.